there. In my work with Human Life International, we're present in 88 countries, and I've been to 65 of them so far. So I'm still continuing as the Director of International Coordination to visit all these different countries. But I'd like to start the talk on the Obama administration and the world pro-life situation by going over a little bit what is the world pro-life situation. Many people know what's going on here in the United States, but they don't have a clear sort of global picture of the situation around the world. And there are a lot of surprising things in that. First of all, it would probably surprise most of the people here to know that most countries around the world have pro-life laws. The majority of countries in the world have pro-life laws. Now, the majority of world population live in countries that have pro-abortion laws. And that's principally because China, India, the United States have abortion on demand. But most countries in Africa, most countries in Latin America, most countries in the Middle East, most Muslim majority countries, some countries in Europe, such as Poland, Ireland, Malta, have pro-life laws. And there's significant change going on around the world in the pro-life sphere. So it's interesting to kind of take a global view. I'll start with the good news, then I'll give you some of the bad news recently, and then we'll go on into the Obama administration, and I'll let you decide whether it's good or bad news. The first thing, looking at Latin America, it's interesting that when you see Mexico, 11 states in Mexico. Mexico is, of course, the United States of Mexico, just like we have the United States of America. So the federal states in Mexico have their own constitutions. And 11 of those states have passed laws that defend life from conception to natural death. 11 of the 31 states. Mexico City, the capital, has a large liberal majority, and they legalized abortion in 2007. And actually, it's in contradistinction against that all the different states in Mexico have started passing these pro-life state constitutions against that. Now, in other parts of Latin America, countries are also passing these pro-life constitutions. The Dominican Republic, just 2 weeks ago, reformed their constitution to say life begins at conception and must be protected until natural death. Honduras passed a law banning the Morningafter pill because it has an abortifacient quality, and then went against their national laws. Uruguay actually dodged a bullet last year. There was a proposal to legalize abortion in Uruguay in South America, and that proposal was defeated. So it's a dynamic situation, but by and large, Latin America has strong pro-life leanings. Also, interestingly enough, in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in the post-Soviet countries, post-communist era countries, the pro-life side is gaining momentum. And Slovakia is going to vote on a law this June, actually, that would start limiting abortion from the communist era law. Lithuania had a bill this past year that was going to limit abortion to basically rape, incest, and life of the mother. That bill was not voted on. It'll probably come up again. But Russia and Ukraine both have started putting limitations in on the abortions that are allowed in their countries. And there's kind of a national consensus that seems to be growing in Eastern Europe that abortion is a problem and they need to work back against it. So that's very good. On the other hand, when we look at the rest, sort of Western Europe, the situation there continues to be quite grim. Luxembourg last year legalized euthanasia. And there's kind of a trend. Actually, they were talking about the monarchies in Europe legalizing euthanasia first, because the Netherlands, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, legalized euthanasia. The Kingdom of Belgium legalized euthanasia, and then, so the Benelux countries, then Luxembourg as well. That was actually over the objections of the Prince of Luxembourg. I actually met him last October, and he said he would resign rather than sign that law legalizing euthanasia in his country. And so they changed the constitution, just as they had done in Belgium, to legalize abortion over the objections of the Catholic monarch. They changed the constitution so the king didn't have to sign the legislation anymore, but they managed to pass that over his objections. In Africa, there's something called the Maputo Protocol, and it's something that we've been pointing out to quite a bit at Human Life International. The Maputo Protocol is actually the protocol on women's rights of the African Union. The African Union is an intergovernmental body, a little bit like the Organization of American States or the Council of Europe, that doesn't have that much authority, but it basically works as a mini UN for the continent. And the Maputo Protocol, which was made in Maputo, Mozambique, calls for the legalization of abortion. Now, it says it's for women's rights, and it has a whole series of different articles in favor of women's rights. But Article 14 calls for the legalization of abortion essentially on demand, and basically for the health, rape, incest, life of the mother, handicap of the child, basically any reason is good for abortion. And countries in Africa have been ratifying this Maputo Protocol without realizing what the contents are, and then later being told, well, you've ratified this, so now you have to change your national legislations. And last year, the country of Togo legalized abortion following ratifying the Maputo Protocol. So the church has been speaking out against it. Pope Benedict XVI, the Bishops' Conference of Africa, the SECHAM as it's called. So we have been also bringing out this information so that countries will realize what's in the Maputo Protocol and fight it back. But there's a lot of pressure in Africa where laws are generally pro-life to legalize abortion. One of the saddest things actually in southern Africa is South Africa. So we all know the problem South Africa ran into for years and years. It seems like South Africa has always had turmoil and problems. From the very beginning, there were quite a lot of issues with the different colonists coming in and fighting each other and the Zulus and whatnot. Then they had the apartheid issue. The first thing that the African National Congress did upon taking control, Nelson Mandela, was to legalize abortion on demand. And today in South Africa, the population is actually declining by 200,000 persons a year. They have a tremendous AIDS problem, a very low birth rate, and South Africa is quite a state right now. But unfortunately, it has a lot of influence in Southern Africa, and other countries are influenced by South Africa in the direction of legalizing abortion. So we're very concerned there. In Asia, the pressing pro-life issue is really sex selection abortion. And I actually have a talk on the back there of the room which goes into this issue, but it's relatively not well known, and it should be. There are over 100 million missing girls in the world today, and several million more missing girls every extra year. Just in China alone, 40 million missing girls. And in India, an estimated 10 million missing girls, and every year more and more and more. What's happened since the 70s is with the advent of new technologies, individuals can determine the sex of the child before birth. So with sonograms, now you can do that. Even before with amniocentesis, you could tell the sex of the child before birth. Well, in countries that have a strong son preference, this led to the selective abortion of baby girls to such an extent that there are literally millions and millions of missing girls. And the problem has its epicenter in China and India, but it's actually a growing global phenomenon. So it's relatively easy to trace which countries have sex selection abortion simply by looking at the birth ratios between boys and girls in the countries. And we know what the natural ratios are, so we can tell what's going on. In countries in Western Europe, we're seeing skewed birth ratios. So it's the case in Serbia, it's the case in Yugoslavia, well, former Yugoslavia, different parts, Greece, Luxembourg, Norway, a number of countries that we would think of as very modern, progressive, but that are clearly showing discrimination against baby girls. It's even occurring in Latin America, in countries like El Salvador and Venezuela. It's occurring in North Africa and Egypt, Tunisia. So this whole sex selection issue and scandal really is quite remarkable. And I always find it a very interesting topic because it sort of points out some of the hypocrisy associated with the abortion issue. Many groups that are in favor of legalized abortion will say that it's a women's rights issue, that this is something to help women. And when you look at sex selection abortion, it's clear that abortion is being used as the ultimate form of discrimination against women. And in 2007, Korea actually brought forth a resolution at the UN, at the Commission on the Status of Women, to condemn unequivocally sex selection abortion. And the different feminist organizations who are present at the UN actively lobbied against that resolution and convinced the European Union and China to go forward and to block it so that it didn't actually pass. Well, these organizations basically reasoned that they were in favor of abortion for any reason And when you started banning abortion for any sort of reason or condemning any sort of abortion, it was like a slippery slope in the other direction. So they weren't in favor of even banning sex selection abortion, which is really tragic. Finally, the Islamic world. Probably a surprise for most of you here would be that the Parliament of Iran just a few weeks ago voted a law legalizing abortion in Iran in the case of handicapped children. And the guardians of the Islamic Revolution came out against that, and it looks like it may not actually pass. But the Islamic Republic of Iran has a birth rate of 1.7 children. They're far below replacement. We think of Europe, as being the place with no children, not having enough children to replace its population. But many of the largest Muslim countries in the world today are having below replacement fertility. So starting with Iran, 1.7 children, but Turkey is only at 2.2. Algeria is like 1.8 children per family. Indonesia is about 2.3. So the birth rate right now in the Muslim countries is dropping like a stone. And it's one of these underreported phenomena around the world. The same is true for Latin America. I was in Mexico in March, and it was quite surprising to the Mexicans to hear that Mexican Americans, Mexicans who immigrated to the United States, have more children in the US than Mexicans in Mexico. And the issue of immigration from Mexico to the United States is not going to be an issue in a few years because there are not going to be Mexicans to come across. The younger population of Mexico is declining, actually. So that's sort of a world overview, what is going on in the world. We live in a largely pro-life world, particularly in Latin America, in Africa, and in the Middle East. It's the industrialized countries that have legalized abortion and the mega countries such as India and China. But into this mix comes the Obama administration. And what kind of influence is it going to have? Well, it was interesting to me to see that there was a meeting that took place between Cardinal George, who's the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and President Obama just a few weeks ago. And at that meeting, President Obama said that he was not pro-abortion, and that if you would just wait and see, he was going to show, the fact that he was actually a good guy on this issue. And it's interesting, I saw another article that spoke about the way that Obama, when he was actually the head of the Harvard Law Review, managed to speak on topics such that people on both sides of the issue thought that he agreed with them. And he seems to be kind of a master of equivocation, of saying something that everybody can agree with that doesn't have that much content. So we have to kind of go a little bit deeper into where Obama's position is on abortion and what he's going to be doing. I was actually at 40,000 feet and going about 600 miles per hour when the word came over the PA system on the airplane that Senator Obama had been elected president. And there was sort of scattered applause on the airplane. I then landed in the Central African Republic, and I was meeting with the Archbishop of Bangui, and he congratulated me on the election of President Obama. And so I sort of informed him that we were kind of apprehensive that President Obama was going to do a lot against the pro-life cause. And it sort of flabbergasted him, that oh, really, Obama might be in favor of abortion? And around the world where I go, people have no idea, it seems, where Barack Obama stands on the abortion issue, and which is, quite surprising. But there really was no doubt as the campaign season for the Democratic primaries were going on where the candidates stood on abortion. All the Democratic candidates were in favor of legalized abortion. And to me, one of the most disheartening things to see, really, was the debate between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, where they were doing a kind of one-upmanship to see who could be more in favor of legalized abortion. And in the end, Barack Obama won that debate because he could point out to the fact that he had been against the Infants Born Alive Act, that law that said that children who were born alive from an attempted abortion should be, resuscitated and medical help should be provided to them. There was a federal law of this nature that Hillary Clinton actually voted in favor of, but there was a state law in Illinois which Barack Obama was opposed to. Now, also there was the partial birth abortion ban, that was passed on the federal level, but there was also a state level law in Illinois. And at the state level law, Barack Obama led the fight against that law as well, against any sort of ban on partial birth abortion. Hillary Clinton actually went in favor of the ban on partial birth abortion as it was presented on the federal level. She was trying to present a more moderate image. But during the campaign, it was clear who was the more pro-abortion candidate. Finally, it was Barack Obama. Also, something that really struck me during the presidential debates, there was a question that was posed as to who was, what was your greatest mistake? What's your greatest regret in political office? And the response that Barack Obama gave was, he regretted voting to save Terry Schiavo. That was his greatest regret. And he would do otherwise if he was given the chance again. When Senator Biden was asked the same question, he said essentially his greatest regret was that when he was first elected to the Senate, he would vote on federal judges, the confirmation of federal judges and Supreme Court judges, based on the fact of whether or not they were qualified for the office. That was his regret. Now what he says is that he would vote based upon whether they had progressive views of the Constitution, whether they were in favor of abortion rights, and all these different basically litmus tests were the real reason to vote for or against members of the federal judiciary. So again, abortion being prominent in all these nominations to the courts, he was basically saying that he regretted forever having voted in favor of a pro-life judge. Well, this administration, then Obama or Biden, regrets the few pro-life things that they possibly did in the past and is fully in favor of any possible pro-abortion things they could do in the future. The other thing, of course, from the campaign that many of you have probably seen was that infamous YouTube video where Senator Obama, in front of a Planned Parenthood audience, said that the first thing that he would do in office would be to sign the Freedom of Choice Act into law. Of course, it was a ridiculous thing to say, because the first thing that he could do in office would not be to sign legislation which the Congress would first have to pass. But it sort of gave a position of where one stands. The Freedom of Choice Act is essentially everything that the abortion lobby in the United States could want. It's the sort of dream package. It would make abortion, any restrictions on abortion, void. It would make conscientious objection of abortion absolutely unacceptable, so doctors would not be able to refuse to perform abortions. Hospitals could be forced to perform abortions. Medical students could be forced to perform abortions as part of their medical training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Freedom of Choice Act really is a compilation of the most extreme abortion legislation that the National Organization for Women and NARAL and Planned Parenthood have been able to come up with. Well, since then, since being elected and being in office, Barack Obama has said that the Freedom of Choice Act is a lower priority now than the economy, say. But he's still not said that he's against it. He's still in favor of it. It's just not the very first thing that he's going to do, which hopefully Congress will never pass. But it's there present. Well, the other thing to do, pro-lifers were saying that the Obama administration would be the most pro-abortion administration in US history. Now, Bill Clinton's administration set a pretty high bar for pro-abortion administration. The first thing that President Bill Clinton did when he was in office was sign an executive order revoking the Mexico City policy. The Mexico City policy is the policy that US foreign aid dollars cannot go to organizations that promote or perform abortion. And it was actually put into place by President Ronald Reagan back in the 80s during the 1984 World Conference on Population and Development, which was in Mexico City, so they called it the Mexico City policy. The other thing that President Clinton did was to veto the partial birth abortion ban twice. So that being a pretty high bar, you wonder how the Obama administration could be more pro-abortion. Well, this year at the March for Life, every year in Washington, D.C., on January 22nd, we have the March for Life. And there's generally about 100,000 people who come. And just huge mass of people are there to stand up for life, and usually in the bitter cold. It's frequent in end of January there to have snow on the ground or at least freezing temperatures. This year there were about 200,000 people, so it was about double the size generally that the march is. And of course, every year this gets reported in the Washington Post on page 6, on the Metro section, that some people showed up for the pro-life event. But this is the largest event, public event in DC during most years that just goes completely underreported. And it was also the first full day in office of President Barack Obama. And so people were wondering whether he would repeat Bill Clinton's action of the first thing he would do to sign the executive order revoking the Mexico City policy. And the Obama administration didn't do that. And it was interesting to see from the stage different ministers and rabbis and other people coming forward and saying, please, President Obama, don't do this. You've said that you're in favor of change, in favor of bipartisanship. Don't do this anti-life thing. And there was all this hopefulness in the air. He didn't do it, he didn't do it. The very next day, they did. So January 23rd, Obama signed the executive order revoking the Mexico City policy. I was actually called, it was interesting to see, it was very clever, I thought, on the part of the Obama administration, because it was a Friday, the last day of the week. So in terms of the news cycle, what happens on a Friday afternoon doesn't get reported very much. And instead of doing it, when there were 200,000 people milling around Washington, D.C. who would be protesting, he did it the very next day whenever people were going home, and very few people were present to comment on it, even in the press. I got called to do a BBC interview on it late that evening, but it was very few people could even respond or hear about it as the weekend progressed. So it was clear that the Obama administration wasn't trying to put this forward as a top priority, but they were paying their debts to those who had elected them, basically liberals and feminists who wanted this to happen. And I think we're going to see a lot of that from the Obama administration. They're going to try and get the pro-abortion agenda moved forward in as least a controversial or confrontational way as possible, which is probably why I think the Freedom of Choice Act is not going to be brought up as a whole. It'll probably be tried to implement it piecemeal because it's too easy to oppose and show the extreme nature of it. Well, the other interesting thing about this whole, I would say, strategy of the Obama administration was the appointment of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. So bringing her on board, I mean, the one thing that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton definitely agree on is pro-abortion strategy and spreading the pro-abortion message, legalized abortion around the world. And I think Hillary Clinton is going to be the front person, in a way, of the Obama administration in spreading this. And she's already started to do that. Looking at the sort of whole foreign policy situation, when Hillary Clinton made her first trip to China, I thought it was very interesting to see that she made a public statement that human rights were no longer the most important issue between the US and China. That was going to take a sort of a back seat to economic issues, to nuclear non-proliferation with North Korea, all these other issues, but the one-child policy and human rights issues in China would not be a priority of the United States. So a clear step back from a kind of a pro-life concern. Then in March, I was at the United Nations for the Commission on the Status of Women. And that's an annual meeting where there's a lot of talk generally about the abortion issue. And all the different countries that are represented at the UN discuss the issue, and a lot of resolutions are brought forward. And over the last several years, a lot of different pro-life things have come out, principally because the Bush administration had been pushing them, and there had been a strong sort of international support for them. So there was an international resolution passed against human cloning, all forms of human cloning. And it was interesting because there was a resolution that was being brought forward that would only ban so-called reproductive cloning and allow so-called therapeutic cloning. So a kind of a clone and kill. And all these different groups were saying, let's not totally ban human cloning, just the kind that would have live babies born out of it. When the UN actually passed this ban on all forms of human cloning, again, it was buried at the bottom of the newspapers, etc., because it wasn't the sort of resolution that the other side wanted to see. So I was curious, what was going to happen now that the US administration had gone over to the pro-abortion side at this Commission on the Status of Women. And very interestingly, almost nothing happened. The US administration was in favor of reproductive health and reproductive health services, which are kind of code words for abortion in the document. But the coalition of pro-life countries kept it all out of out of the document in the end, it didn't pass. And it looked like the new US delegation, although they were very much in favor of abortion, were also incredibly disorganized, didn't know how things were functioning there, didn't know how to move things, create the kind of coalitions that are necessary to get things done at the UN. So the Obama administration, if it wants to be effective at the UN, is going to have to get a little bit more organized and start building some bigger coalitions. But certainly the tone has changed. And then there was the most famous thing. I was actually in Mexico at the time when Hillary Clinton was there as well. And I was speaking at a conference in Mexicali in the north. And everybody there was just shocked when Hillary Clinton went to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe and sort of did a little protocol. And Our Lady of Guadalupe, of course, is the patroness of Mexico, the patroness of the Americas, and also in a special way, the patroness of the pro-life movement. This 16th century apparition there in Mexico is an image of Our Lady who's pregnant, and she's wearing that cincture around her waist that's the sign of a pregnant woman. And so the pro-life movement has really adopted Our Lady of Guadalupe as a symbol of the pro-life nature, pro-life aspect of Our Lady. So Hillary Clinton comes up, and she had not been briefed about the miraculous image, that the image itself had just appeared miraculously on the tilma of St. Juan Diego. So she asked the rector of the shrine, who painted it? And without skipping a beat, the rector said, God, and just came right back at her. But it was interesting to me because it showed a certain lack of professionalism. The US Secretary of State, going to the most famous shrine in Mexico, had not been briefed as to the history of the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And on the very next day, and it made the newspapers, all these caricatures, political cartoons showed up in Mexican newspapers of Hillary Clinton asking who painted Our Lady of Guadalupe. And the Mexicans were just laughing at this, kind of ignorance. But the very next day, she accepted the Margaret Sanger Award from Planned Parenthood here in the United States. And a lot of people did this juxtaposition. There's one day she's putting flowers in front of Our Lady of Guadalupe, patroness of the pro-life movement, and the next day she's getting the Margaret Sanger Award, and in her acceptance speech saying she's in awe of all that Margaret Sanger did. And she was such a wonderful, transformational woman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one has to wonder if Hillary Clinton knows all the things that Margaret Sanger said and did. Because the amazing amount of racist, eugenicist, just completely unacceptable diatribes that came out from Margaret Sanger about, breeding a race of thoroughbreds, getting rid of the black population in the United States, all these different, just incredibly racist and eugenicist leanings of the American Birth Control League, which Margaret Sanger founded, which became Planned Parenthood, kind of precludes an individual saying that they're in awe of this person. Congressman Chris Smith did a wonderful speech actually on the floor of the US Congress pointing this out, that Hillary Clinton would have to choose between Our Lady of Guadalupe and Margaret Sanger, but you couldn't have both, the kind of diametrical opposites. Well, on April 22nd, testifying before the House Foreign Affairs, International Affairs Committee, Hillary Clinton said that it was going to become the foreign policy of the United States to promote the reproductive rights of women around the world. And she further said upon questioning that she saw that the right to legal abortion was included among these reproductive rights. So the United States government is going to be promoting legal abortion around the world. And so not only have we revoked the Mexico City policy, which is going to be leading to funds flowing to Planned Parenthood and Marie Stopes and all these other organizations that perform abortions and lobby for the legalization of abortion around the world, but the U.S. Foreign Service, State Department, is actually going to be pushing for legalized abortion around the world as an open part of U.S. foreign policy. And I think this is one of the biggest threats that's going to come out of the Obama administration around the world. The other issue that I think is very significant is the whole issue of conscience rights, conscientious objection. One of the last acts of the Bush administration was to pass a Department of Health and Human Services regulation that doctors and nurses, medical personnel would not be forced to perform abortions, would not be forced to go against their consciences, and that there would be no withdrawing of federal grants or other things for institutions or individuals who refused to, for reasons of conscience, to get involved in abortion or other embryonic stem cell research or other things of this nature. The Obama administration has already put in place, it's actually a process. You can't do this overnight. It takes a consultation. It takes about 90 days to take place. But they've already started the process of rescinding those rights of conscience so that individuals could be forced to put in place, to perform abortions or choose between some kind of collaboration with abortion and federal grants. The other issue that I think is going to be very big is euthanasia. Having now at Health and Human Services former Governor Sebelius, one of the things that she said actually coming in is that she's in favor of reforming healthcare, and the Obama administration as well, on the basis of reducing costs, and especially looking at reducing the cost of healthcare for the terminally ill. And a number of people have been telling me that there's a lot of move in place here for essentially expanding euthanasia. An assistant attorney general that was appointed by Obama was the lawyer who was on behalf of Mr. Schiavo arguing the case for turning off food and water and basically killing Terry Schiavo. So I think the euthanasia aspect of the Obama administration is going to be quite pronounced as well. I mean, one of the easiest ways of reducing healthcare costs is instituting a form of euthanasia, of withdrawing food and water, withdrawing just life support care, or just determining what individuals have the right, rationing healthcare in such a way that you're essentially going to be killing off patients. And globally, looking at the situation around the world, euthanasia and doctor-assisted suicide are some of the big issues in a lot of the aging societies around the world, particularly in Western Europe. Another issue that came up was the Morningafter pill. There was a regulation whether it should or should not be required by prescription. And there was a court that ruled that 17-year-olds should be able to get the Morningafter pill without a prescription. And the Obama administration had no objection to this. And I think there's going to be a greater move in that direction as well. So pushing sort of contraception, sex education, and also cutting off all forms of abstinence education, et cetera. That seems to be a clear thrust of the Obama administration. And then finally, Supreme Court nominations. We have the clear announcement that Justice Souter is going to be retiring at the end of the session here, and so Obama will have a chance to appoint a Supreme Court justice, and he's made it very, very clear that he will be nominating abortion rights favorable justices. So just as President Bush was able to nominate 2 justices who were in favor of a pro-life view of the Constitution, it looks like Obama is going to have a big impact as well on shaping the Supreme Court. Certainly one Supreme Court justice, and possibly Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg may be extremely ill, and so it may be possible that she will either retire or pass away in the next few years. So he may actually get to name 2 justices. And John Paul Stevens, who's the elderly member of the court as well, is quite in favor of abortion also. So the Obama administration could have a huge impact on abortion policy that way. So what are the world consequences going to be of the Obama administration's position on abortion? I think the worst effects will probably come in Africa and Latin America. In Africa, as I was there in Senegal, so many countries that I've visited in Africa have a hugely pro-life culture. And it's clear that the people don't want to have abortion in those countries. But the political elites are quite corrupt. And it's quite possible to coerce these elites or to offer them a deal that they can't refuse to legalize abortion. And with the huge amounts of foreign aid that are being offered, the pressure that comes from the African Union through the Maputo Protocol, the European Union, now the United States, pushing for abortion legalization, I think a lot of countries are going to find it very hard to resist the temptation to legalize abortion. Most countries in Africa do not have a clear, responsive government to the majority opinion in their countries. Actually, the United States doesn't have a clear, responsive government as well. There was a poll that came out today that said that 51% of Americans identify as pro-life, and only 22% of Americans are in favor of our current situation, which is abortion on demand for any or all reasons. So only 22% of the US population is in favor of our current legislation. So how democratic is that, even here in the United States? But in Africa, the elites can certainly pass laws and enforce them without a majority being behind them. So that's going to be quite an issue. In Latin America, there's also kind of a big push towards the left. In many countries, the new kind of left-leaning regimes are very much influenced by Fidel Castro, where, of course, abortion is completely legal on demand in Cuba. One of the things that was quite surprising when I went to Cuba about 3 years ago, that it's kind of hard for American citizens. So Obama's making it easier now for US citizens to go to Cuba, but back then, to go there, you had to actually get a permit from the US Treasury Department to go to Cuba because of the embargo. And so we managed to get one of these permits and go, but when we were in Cuba, the interesting thing that we found out was abortion is huge there. It's one of the highest abortion rates in the world, and the reason for it is actually Fidel Castro's megalomania. And it really surprised me to hear this, but Fidel Castro has an obsession with having a lower infant mortality rate than the United States of America. He wants his health statistics to be better than America's health statistics. And the way to do that, of course, is to diagnose any pregnancy where there might be a possibility of a handicapped child, any possibility of a complication in pregnancy, and to abort all those children who then don't show up as sick children who don't grow the infant mortality rate. So there's a huge pressure in Cuba if the mother is slightly older, if there's any possibility that the child would have any kind of problem, they push abortion quite a bit. And Cuba has a huge number of doctors. They have a policy of training up enormous numbers of physicians, and Castro actually exports these medical doctors all over the world. And he makes quite a lot of money. He sends the doctors to the countries, and then part of their salary is sent back to the Cuban government. But these doctors are trained up with the communist mentality that's very much in favor of abortion. And so when they're there in Venezuela or other countries in Latin America, they're actively pushing for changes in the pro-life laws in these countries. I was in East Timor 2 years ago, and there in Asia, they have about 200 Cuban doctors. About half the doctors in the country are Cuban. And people were telling me about sterilizations and abortions going on, even though the laws are quite pro-life in East Timor, but because of the Cuban doctors. So I think Latin America is also, because of the different left-leaning administrations, going to see a lot of fight anyway, struggle to maintain their pro-life laws and status. I think at the level of the United Nations, the Obama administration is going to get its act together eventually, and their delegations are probably going to start being more effective at pushing the abortion agenda within the UN. Also, the United Nations Population Fund, which is the largest fund at the United Nations that promotes population control and birth control, family planning, but also collaborates with the Chinese one-child policy. So they're actively involved in some of these abortion issues as well. The Obama administration announced that they were going to give them $50 million this year, and then in future years as well. The UNFPA had been cut off from funding because of its collaboration with the one-child policy in China under the Bush administration. Now the UNFPA will be getting all this money and probably will be emboldened to act a little bit further because there's a clear sign that the US administration will support any sort of pro-abortion activity. USAID, which for many years around the world has been the largest single source of birth control and family planning around the world. Their budget has actually been upped by $88 million in this new budget. So it's going to be $595 million spent on birth control around the world by USAID. And they even passed a law which was very interesting. They changed one of the regulations in the law that they no longer have to source from the United States. So previously, USAID had to buy all of its birth control in the United States where it's more expensive. Also higher quality, but more expensive. Now they're going to be able to buy it from China and other countries where they can get lower quality and less expensive birth control, so they can, more bang for the buck, if you will, on top of having more money to spend. And also, and I think this is kind of one of the more serious aspects of the Obama administration's impact on the world pro-life situation, is just the division that is being caused within pro-life and particularly Catholic ranks. So we all know about the big controversy about President Obama going to Notre Dame University. But about 79, I guess, bishops now have come out against his going there, et cetera. But there's a huge division within the Catholic Church about how to deal with the Obama administration. There was an article that appeared in the Osservatore Romano, so the official, semi-official publication of the Catholic Church in Rome. It was entitled I 100 giorni che non hanno sconvolto il mondo, the 100 days that haven't changed the world. And it essentially said the Obama administration hasn't done that many bad things. And the individual was not aware of most of the things that I've been telling you tonight. But our Rome office with Human Life International has been seeing a lot of this in the Roman Curia, people who are just reflexively in favor of Obama, not really aware of his pro-abortion positions, and just kind of saying, well, we hope he'll be a good guy, and we think we can work with him or something like this. So it seems to me that there's quite a lot of division within the Catholic Church, which, frankly speaking, the principal bulwark against abortion around the world is the Catholic Church. I was told in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that they had a bill that was brought forward to legalize abortion. And the Minister of Health was sponsoring this bill. And there was a Catholic nun who had actually taught this Minister of Health back when she was in Catholic school, and went to have a private meeting with her and said, did you learn nothing? And just basically talked with her throughout basically an evening and convinced her not to go forward. She withdrew the legislation. They would have legalized abortion in the Congo had it not been for that Catholic nun. And there's so many countries where the bishops, together have managed to stop legalization of abortion. In the reversal of the legalization of abortion in Poland, when they passed from the communist-era abortion law to the current pro-life laws, basically it was the Catholic Church and Pope John Paul II that were the motivating factors for that. So if the Catholic Church is not united in its purpose on this Obama issue, we're really facing a big problem. So, kind of in conclusion, there's a number of issues that I think are quite positive. As we're looking at the situation here in the United States, I'm always very interested by demography, and what's going on in terms of just people and the numbers. So we saw that 51% of Americans just today, it was announced, self-identify as pro-life, and this is an uptrend over the years. There's a demographer by the name of Philip Longman who did a study of the 2000 census here in the United States. And the census pulls up a lot of data, not just population. And one of the things that he saw was that in the greater Seattle area, in Seattle, Washington, there were 19% more dogs than children in the average household. So, in the most liberal part of the United States, one of the most liberal parts of the United States, individuals were having pets rather than children. When you went to sort of red state America, and you looked at the demographic data there, you saw that people were having children, a larger number of children than pets. 45% more to be exact. But clearly there's a big difference between liberal America and conservative America. And one of the reasons I believe that the Obama administration, there was that big flap over taking control over the census and taking it away from the Census Bureau and moving it under the executive branch, is because when the 2010 census is performed and then Congress is reapportioned, it's very clear that the blue states, by and large, are going to be losing congressional seats and therefore votes in the Electoral College for the 2012 election. And it's probably going to be much more difficult for a liberal candidate to win the 2012 presidential elections than it was in 2008, simply from the Electoral College shift towards the South, predominantly in more red state America. Globally speaking, we're seeing the same thing. Within societies, the more conservative families, more conservative sectors are the ones having children. Even in Europe, where they don't have very many children, within those societies, those who are more conservative are the ones who are having more children. And therefore, the future sort of belongs to the young, belongs to those who tend to be more pro-life. And in just our own polling data, it was very interesting to see that those who self-identify as in favor of abortion tend to have much fewer children than those who identify as pro-life. One of our researchers, Dr. Brian Close, in the 2000 election, did a little tabulation of self-identified pro-choice and pro-lifers, and estimated that Al Gore would have won the state of Florida by about 70,000 votes if children had not been aborted. If the children who had been aborted in Florida had been born to their Democratic parents and had voted Democratic as their parents had, Al Gore would have been elected in the 2000 election. So it's already having effects on elections. There's also kind of just a general overview, I would say, of the world moving in this direction of being more pro-life. But I think we have 4 very long years to go, and the pro-lifers need to be very active. And I think particularly within the Catholic Church, very aware of the pro-life threats that are coming forward. And not just the Freedom of Choice Act, but euthanasia and a very aggressive U.S. foreign policy in favor of abortion. So I'll stop there and just take some questions.